This is Barry Shaw from the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, and this is The View from Israel. Today, I'm not going to talk to you about Israel. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of events that are equally important, or perhaps almost as important as talking about Israel. Just a few days ago from this recording, the new president of Iran was inaugurated, Ebrahim Raisi, known locally in Iran by the opposition, by the students, by the protest groups, as the Butcher of Tehran. He earned that title by being the chief judiciary officer of the Iranian regime under Khomeini in 1988. And from that time until recently, he was responsible for the torture and murder of many thousands of Iranians. Also, people in the opposition, protesters that were arrested, disappeared, tortured, executed. He was given the title of the Butcher of Tehran for his mass executions, mainly by hanging and slow deaths. 2 years ago, a man by the name of Hamid Nouri was arrested as he got off a plane in Stockholm, Sweden, and detained because there had been a complaint from international human rights activists, particularly those involved in exposing the human rights from Iran, that Mr. Nori was an official of the regime in 1988, and he personally was involved with the execution of many hundreds of Iranians. And the third part of our story is Mr. Nori started his appearance in a Swedish court on August the 10th, where he is on trial for international crimes, including human rights crimes and war crimes. This is the purpose of this initial interview, and my first special guest is going to be a lawyer who is participating in the case, representing 4 of the plaintiffs, Mr. Kenneth Lewis. Kenneth, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here and giving us your time.
Okay.
To begin with, let me ask you as a question that occurred to me when I was first introduced to you. How is it that Kenneth Lewis is originally from the United States, is one of the lead lawyers in a very important trial in Stockholm, Sweden? How do we go from Kenneth in America to a Swedish courthouse?
Well, I ended up in Sweden a long time ago, and after some time doing different things, I re-educated myself and became an attorney here. And one of my clients happened to be the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, PMOI, who asked me to go down to Iraq in 2004 because the United States Army had interned their members who had a camp in Iraq. So I went down there and I worked together with this organization to get the United States to stop interning them, and which succeeded after a while. And later I then went on I belonged to a team of lawyers, international lawyers, who got them off the European Union's terror list. They had been listed as terrorist organization, and even later on getting them off the American terror list. So I have worked with and for the People's Mujahideen Organization for a long time.
All right, so Mr. Hamid Nouri arrives in Stockholm, Sweden, gets off his plane and finds himself detained by the police and questioned in a room based on some complaints that were given to the authorities in Sweden by some Iranian human rights activists. And they detained Hamid Nouri, and Hamid Nouri is now in a Swedish court in a very, very important and significant trial. Can you tell us something about the background of Hamid Nouri?
Well, Hamid Nouri, as far as the investigation shows, was a middle-level official of the Iranian regime who was moved from Evin prison to Goradarch prison sometime in 1988. And he was, we would like to call him an assistant prosecutor or something like that, but he was an official in Goradarch prison, which is in a town not far from Tehran. And he was responsible for all kinds of various activities in Goradarch up until July of 1988, when the then leader of Iran, Khomeini, issued a fatwa against the People's Mujahideen organization, saying that any member or sympathizer of the People's Mujahideen in Iran who was in an Iranian prison and who had not recanted and condemned the People's Mujahideen should be sentenced to death. And he was then in Goradarch prison when this fatwa came, and he then was very important in selecting prisoners, providing information to what we call the Death Commission, a committee composed of 3 so-called judges appointed by Khomeini, who were to decide whether or not sympathizers or members of the People's Mujahideen should be executed or not. So he provided information to this committee. He brought people in front of the committee. He brought people from the committee to the death chamber. He was even, according to some testimony, even present sometimes in the death chamber where they hanged. Probably we have a list of 444 people, which is not complete, but probably 500 or 600 members or sympathizers of the People's Mujahideen. So he wasn't one of the high-level people. He wasn't one of the 3 members of the commission who were sentencing people to death, but he was an intermediate member who was bringing people there, giving information about people and their behavior and so on. And even we have clear indications that he participated in actual torture of people, but even the way they treated these people before and after they were brought to this so-called committee or death commission also was a form of torture. So his indictment on the first point is precisely this, that he was an instrumental part, just like people during the Holocaust who were working in concentration camps and so on. They may not have been the ones who decided to send people there, but he was one of the people who was instrumental in what happened to people in that prison and who was instrumental in the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of people between July and August and regarding the Mujahideen, and between August and September regarding some leftists who were also executed afterwards. So that's what the indictment is about, and that's what they claim that he's done. It's interesting to note that one of the 3 judges appointed by Khomeini for this death commission is the present president of Iran, Raisi. Could be interesting to know. So he was much more instrumental in this.
Yes, I want to get to Raisi later on in the show, but I understand so far as this Hamid Nouri and perhaps even Raisi himself, that the executions and the tortures went beyond the Mujahideen into the political opponents of the Islamic regime in Tehran, that they also were tortured and they also were executed. So he didn't just stop at the People's Mujahideen.
The overwhelming majority of the people who were tortured and executed during this period were Mujahideen and no others. The leftists, it's absolutely true that leftists were tortured and were killed, but the numbers were significantly less. And that's also because the People's Mujahideen was absolutely the largest movement against the mullahs in Iran from 1980 onward.
Okay. So your a role in this trial in Stockholm is as the legal representative of 4 plaintiffs. What can you share with us with regard to some of the evidence that these plaintiffs are going to present to the court?
Well, 2 of my clients are only the surviving relatives of 2 persons who were executed at this particular time in Goradash. So they will only testify about the facts that their brothers were there, and then tell about what they know about how they were executed and what they heard from their relatives, or what they themselves understood about what had happened, how the authorities, after some months, called them and gave them a little bag with the last possessions of their relatives, their brothers, and so on. The other 2 of my clients were survivors. They were people who, as time went on while these executions were taking place, people came to understand that that was actually what was happening. Some people actually saw the bodies being removed from the death chamber and so on. And so they began to understand that this so-called commission that they were supposed to speak in front of was actually giving death sentences. So then some of these people learned that it's best to say that, okay, I recant. Okay, I'm not supporting the People's Mujahideen, and so on. And so some of them survived. And these 2 clients were such people, and they can testify on the whole process, on what happened to them, how they were called to this committee, how they sat in the corridor together with other people, how they saw what Hamid Nouri's role in the whole thing was, how these people were brought in front of the committee, and what they said when they came out, how they were marched away to the execution, and so on. So they have very concrete testimony, the 2 who are survivors. They saw everything except the actual execution because they weren't killed.
What you're describing here is really sort of similar to people who had horrible experience in the concentration and death camps. But it takes direct evidence to expose Adolf Eichmann as being the head Gestapo chief responsible for the whole master plan. Do any of your 4 plaintiffs or any of the other plaintiffs that will be giving evidence have direct evidence pointing to Mr. Hamid Nouri as his personal involvement in the tortures and executions?
Well, all of them have seen him calling out the names of the people who were to be brought to execution. Almost all of them have seen him march people to the actual death chamber where they were executed. 1 or 2 of them have actually seen the death chamber, been in the death chamber without being executed themselves. Probably they were brought there to scare them or as some form of torture. But at least 1 of them has seen Hamid Nouri participate in the murder, in the execution of some people in the death chamber. So yes, there is testimony from the very beginning of what he did to bring people to this committee, to what he did when people were waiting in this long corridor outside of the committee, and then in this other corridor outside of the death chamber. And so the indictment is very, very concrete and very precise about exactly what he's done.
How many plaintiffs and witnesses will be giving testimony, and how long do you think this trial will be going on for?
There are 29 plaintiffs, most of whom are survivors, but some of whom are the relatives of people who were executed. I believe that 23 of them are from the Mujahideen, and 6 are from various leftist organizations. Then there are, I believe, 29 witnesses. Many of the witnesses are in fact leftists because of international law. The prosecutor didn't feel that it was possible to get Hamid Nouri convicted for the crimes in the same way. You can't use the same international human rights law against the regarding the leftists. So some of the ones who are themselves surviving victims and so on are only getting allowed to testify. They have not been accepted as plaintiffs. But there are about 29 witnesses, both from the leftists and from the Mujahideen. In addition, there are so-called expert witnesses of various kinds, amongst others, people from this Iran tribunal that was held many years ago, from Amnesty International, other kinds of experts who have studied what happened in Iran in 1988, about the fatwa, about what happened afterwards, and so on. So it's lots of testimony, lots of plaintiffs, lots of testimony, lots of expert witnesses. And this trial is planned to go on until April of 2022.
What if you're successful in this trial? What sort of sentence do you think the Swedish court will bring down on Hamid Nouri if found guilty?
He could receive life in prison. He might possibly, it depends on exactly how the court judges all of the evidence, because the prosecutor has included some alternatives in the indictment. So if you can't prove his actual participation in some of the murders or executions, he will only be convicted in some cases of being a party to the crime. In other words, that he helped to bring about these executions. So he could get anywhere from probably 16, 18 years to life in prison. He might get some consideration, some reduction, because such a long time has passed since the crimes were committed, but it's hard to say. There's not very much precedent in cases like this. We've only had a few cases resembling this in Sweden.
Well, based on the fact that similar crimes are similar crimes are going on today throughout Iran under the regime, do you think it would be sufficient that this trial, if it gets wrapped up in April and May and he gets sentenced, that the whole issue of the human rights crimes that are going on still within the regime should stop there with the sentencing of Nori, or perhaps it should, in fact, go further from beyond the Swedish court into further action? Maybe, for instance, because Sweden is in Europe, bring it into the International Criminal Court at The Hague to, in fact, use this as a template to have the International Court investigate these crimes on a wider scale within Iran.
Well, I think it's quite accurate to say that the case made against Hamid Nouri is in fact a case being made against the entire regime. So, and it was interesting to listen to the prosecutor today, because she made a very long exposition of the history of the human rights issue in Iran after 1979. And I would say that this indictment in reality is an indictment of the entire regime. The present so-called highest leader in Iran, Khamenei, was at that time president of Iran, and he is definitely responsible for the continued human rights crimes that have been committed after the death of Khamenei. As I said, the president, Raisi, was one of the three members of this commission which decided on executing thousands of people. So I would say, yes, this could definitely be the basis of either an international prosecution, or, in fact, the prosecution from any single state. If any of these people were to set foot in any jurisdiction outside of Iran, they could be prosecuted. And there's plenty of evidence, and the evidence presented to this court could easily be used against them as well.
Yes, I would very much like to speak to and interview some of the leading Iranian human rights activists and advocates, because I don't believe this case should end in a Swedish court. I think it should go on to, with the demand of the International Criminal Court, to investigate Iran for these crimes and beyond, and extend the link. It cannot and must not stop with Hamid Nouri. Just as at the same time, the United Nations Human Rights Council must be made aware of this case going on in Sweden and address it in the United Nations. I just want to ask you before we get on that actually in September, a month after the start of your trial, the United Nations Human Rights Council are holding a conference, a 20-year-old anniversary of the infamous Durban conference in South Africa 20 years ago, where they will be addressing the issues of international human rights abuses and crimes, as well as racism. And I think, and I would call on human rights activists, particularly the ones that have been pressing the issue of human rights issues in Iran itself, to actually go to Durban, South Africa, and press their case to the United Nations and the diplomats who are going to be there. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I can tell you, first of all, that there's an organization called the National Council for Resistance in Iran, NCRI, which has an exile president named Mariam Rajavi, who has called upon the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Committee to start an investigation, number one, of what happened in 1988, but even to go on and discuss the whole issue of human rights abuses in Iran. As you know, they continue to execute people in a completely indiscriminate manner and without any guarantees of normal fair trial guarantees and so on. So that's one actor who has actually demanded that, and I know that there are people in the United Nations Human Rights Committee who are aware of this. Also, Amnesty International has been very, very active around this. They've published 2 reports concerning human rights violations in Iran. The first one a few years ago, also about the 1988 massacre, but they're also following the present situation. I'm sure that Amnesty will obviously be lobbying the United Nations to pursue this question. I'm sure that there are others, other human rights organizations will do the same.
And then finally, what's your knowledge or ideas of the implication of Ibrahim Raisi, who was the chief judiciary chief at the time of other people were being arrested, tortured, and hanged? Raisi, as I said at the opening, is called the Butcher of Tehran. But the people he were executing were less of the Mujahideen and more of the citizens of Iran who have been protesting against the horrendous regime, the regime of the Ayatollahs, and the restrictions of human rights and liberties all over, in fact, Iran. What do you say about what needs to be done to have even the new president of Iran implicated for the crimes that he has been committed? He was the man that signed the death warrants, as you mentioned, with regard to the death commission.
Yes, well, he went on. He was rewarded for his role in the death commission by becoming the head of, I guess you would say, like the Minister of Justice, or the head of the whole judiciary system. And then he was chosen by Khamenei to become president. I mean, you could say that that's his final reward. So the hardliners are definitely in control in Iran, and they are defending violently their own history of massacring the opposition. any kind of opposition. So I think that there's every reason for all democratic states in the world to be prepared to not accept that Raisi be allowed to set his foot outside of Iran without being prosecuted. The evidence being presented in this trial would be sufficient to get him definitely convicted in my mind.
Yes, I don't know if you heard it, Kenneth, but I also heard that, in fact, the Raisi justified what he was doing by saying that he took his instructions from a holy fatwa from Ayatollah Khomeini himself, like it was a holy order. To me, that sounds exactly like a defense for Adolf Eichmann, who said he was taking his orders from Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. It's hardly a defense. I don't know what you, from a legal or even a human rights aspect, you think of that.
Well, number one, that argument didn't defend some of the top Nazis anyway, because, and especially in 1988, after we had already seen the Holocaust, everyone knows that that's not an excuse anymore, because everyone knows that genocide and war crimes and so on are not acceptable. So you can't just follow orders. In fact, the soldier who commits that kind of a crime can be prosecuted, even if he's just following orders. So that won't work. But in my understanding, he's gone even further. He hasn't said that he only followed orders. He's saying that he did it with great enthusiasm and that he was completely in agreement with what the fatwa, what Khomeini's fatwa meant. So he stands up for what he did, and he thinks it was right, and he's continuing to do it.
Yes, that's quite right. Kenneth, I want to wish you the best of luck in this case. We'll be following you closely. Please be in contact with me after your plaintiffs give their evidence and give us a report on this. And viewers, I want you please to share this video with everybody you know. I think we must highlight the horrendous human rights abuses that have been going on and are continuing to be going on inside Iran. I think it should be a cornerstone of the United Nations, the United States negotiations with Iran, not just limiting it to the nuclear deal or even their expansion of their proxies throughout the Middle East, but mainly dealing with the international human rights crimes that are going on, have been going on, as Mr. Lewis explained to us, from 1988 or before 1988 to this year, 2021. Viewers, thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you, Mr. Lewis, for your observations. And like I said, I'll be personally keeping track, and I'll be making more videos as I manage to contact the Iranian human rights activists that have led successfully to this action taking place in Sweden. I hope to be interviewing them soon, and I would like to invite Mr. Lee back on the show as the court proceeds continue. Thank you very much for sharing this. This is Barry Shaw from The View from Israel saying thank you very much.
Thank you.